I always hear British this and British that. Everybody's always making fun of the British all the time. Oh, tea and crumpets. Oh, it's Tuesday. And then the Brit responds, oh, well, at least me school isn't a shooting range. And then we all laugh and say the same 3 lines next week. I think we both need to come up with some new material. Well, if someone is from England, then calling them British is a bit improper. They are English. The English descend from a group of Germanic migrants from northern Europe that came to the island of Britain after Rome fell in the 400s AD. These invaders took over and began to establish kingdoms by the 500s. They brought with them their Germanic customs and language and went on their merry way to start forming the English identity we know today. But you see, the island already had a large population of a Celtic people closely related to the Irish called the Britons. They were subjects of the Roman province Britannia and had thousands of settlements and a healthy populace as well as their own language. Yet when the Anglo-Saxon period began, it all evaporated into thin air. Celtic culture was no longer present in the territory of England, and the Brittonic people were almost archaeologically invisible once the Anglo-Saxons took over. This ghostly mystery is dark in its implications and has been the subject of rigorous research and debate. This debate will be the subject of today's episode of Origins of England. This is episode 2, by the way. I kind of wrote it and titled it so it could be viewed as a standalone video because, I don't know, having the series name in the name of the video itself, it's kind of like bloated and I want to catch eyes and I don't want people to see that it says episode 2 and be like, I don't know, man, I need to watch episode 1 first and that just seems like a big commitment, so I don't know, man. But trust me, watch episode 1. Pretty please. There are 2 schools of thought for the fate of the Britons. Number 1, that they were somewhat eradicated or otherwise brutally subjugated. The armed and militaristic Anglo-Saxons created ethnic barriers and social structure to marginalize or otherwise reduce and wipe clean the territory of England from the Britons. The means and severity of this ethnic cleansing varied region to region. Theory 2 is that the Anglo-Saxons assimilated and interacted with the native Britons in a much more ethical way, making the modern English people the simple merging of 2 distinct groups. How this episode is going to work is I'm going to give the evidence for theory 1, and then the evidence for theory 2, and then using my knowledge from my research, give a sort of hypothesis on how it all went down. All of my sources are peer-reviewed papers on archaeological and biological research using site work and state-of-the-art scientific method, and I will link it all in the description. The majority of the information presented today was simply revealed to me in a dream, though. Just playing. I like to keep things pretty light around here, but a little birdie told me that the whole ethnic cleansing thing makes for a tough crowd, so, but I'll do my best. So, without further ado, this is the H&H Show. I'm your host, Russ Snow. This is the Origins of England, Part 2. Throughout most of history, there was a prevailing view that the Anglo-Saxon migration was on a massive scale. When Rome collapsed, the Anglo-Saxons came, banging on their war drums and in a terrifying volume. A grim scene of just a wave of bratwurst munchers with an agenda to just wipe any of the island's inhabitants off the face of the earth. This theory was somewhat propelled by the English elites from the Middle Ages onwards, because they wanted to distance themselves from the Celtic Irish and others due to a couple opinions they had of them. But as England reached the 20th century, the study of history modernized, and aspects such as the population of Roman Britannia, as well as the logistics of a mass migration came into play. Like just a million blonde-headed troublemakers all showing up to Britain in wooden boats all at once. Where would they get all the boats? Where would they get all the wood for the boats? Where would they get 1 million people to just sign up for this? Just straight up millions of people on the same wavelength being like, yep, sailing the treacherous seas to go wreak havoc on this island and completely uproot my life. Where's the dotted line? So therefore, in the 1980s, the prevailing theory became what is called the elite replacement model, where it was believed that a small number of Germanic warlords came to conquer the island, with Germanic culture passing down due to overlordship, but the populace of the people themselves being the British that were originally there. Plus, there were socio-political reasons for this theory being the prevailing one, because by the time it was the spruce and forward-thinking 1980s, the whole genocide the native people to instate Saxon vigor angle was just a tad unfashionable. There really aren't many people in the world that wouldn't get a bit squeamish from that idea. But the practice of DNA analysis rapidly advanced at the end of the 20th century, with DNA tests able to tell people the specific ethnicity of their respective race. So with this development, a big monkey wrench was thrown into the elite replacement model. When examined, a person from England on average has 40% DNA that is closely related to the modern day Danish and Dutch. When DNA from Ireland or Scotland is examined, there are little to no isotopes that align with said mainland countries, showing that Germanic DNA in the country of England has a stout presence. The amount of this mainland DNA varies region to region, with territories in East England like Kent sometimes having upwards of 80% Germanic DNA, and Northern England generally having a much lower percentage. This revelation goes on to show a couple things. First, there was no mass extermination. Breton DNA is still plenty present in the modern English person. But second, Anglo-Saxon presence in the general population was indeed strong. And in order for their DNA to make up half of the modern English, there had to be some serious social advantages for the migrants. To put it in perspective, the estimated population of post-Roman Britain at the time when the Anglo-Saxons started migrating en masse is 1 to 2 million. When examining archaeological evidence and calculating the logistics of the migration period, there was an estimated 100,000 migrants or so, give or take. This only makes up 10% of the island's population when it's all said and done. So how does Anglo-Saxon DNA now make up half of the average Brexit bloke? The theorized answer is that England most likely had a social structure that intentionally stratified the natives and bolstered the migrants, at least in the first couple centuries. Well, let's take a break from the sciencey stuff for a second, where the composition of people's DNA is analyzed like the ingredients to fertilizer or body wash, and procreation is referred to as mating, and go back to the warm embrace of humanities for a little bit. What evidence is there of an apartheid-like social structure? Well, there's plenty of contemporary documents to support this. In Anglo-Saxon society, there was a law called Vergild, which loosely translates into blood money. If someone was a victim of murder, their family was then owned vergild by the assailant's family, a set dollar or monetary amount that should be received in repentance. The cost of doing business, I guess. In a 7th century law code by King Ine of Wessex, it is stated that the vergild owed for the life of a quote-unquote Welshman, a catch-all term for a native Brit, is significantly less than the vergild owed for a Saxon. Then he goes on to classify the natives and break them down into 6 distinct lowly classes. Bro literally stated that their lives are worth less in writing. In the early Anglo-Saxon writings, the native Wall or Welsh are identified 120 times across the entire country nearly uniformly as an ethnic identifier. The differentiation of a native is still highlighted well into the 8th century writings. In order for this categorization to exist hundreds of years after the initial migration, some serious segregation and there's us and them sentiments had to be in place. But that's just the elites, and the elites are always mean. In order to be one of the 4 guys that knew how to write in early medieval England, you probably had to be an elite. So how did this dynamic play out amongst the common people? Well, now we have to go back to the cold, bony clasp of science. And literally bony in this case, because most of the evidence for this debate from the early Anglo-Saxon period is from burial sites. There's been a few interdisciplinary studies done on these burial sites that use archaeological evidence, bone structure and isolated DNA isotopes to figure out what the dynamics in early England were like. In this research, 3 general trends were revealed. Style 1 is the most common. Families that are Anglo-Saxon are buried together, completely separate from Briton families. The old pagan custom was to bury multiple generations in one chamber. When looking at the bone structure of the dad, grandpa, great-grandpa, etc., there is absolutely no sign of mixing with the natives. This shows that some regions outright banned intermarriage. Also, the Anglo-Saxon burials were notably wealthier. Style 2 was that all of the males were of Anglo-Saxon origin and all of the females were of native origin. Following this initial coupling, the offspring is of course mixed. There's typically no sign of any pure Breton males. This is called the warband model and is only present in rural villages. Use your imagination on how this one played out. The third is only present in the north, and the Anglo-Saxon burials are few and far in between. When an Anglo-Saxon burial is found, they are extremely wealthy though. The rest of the graves seem to be native. A true elite replacement situation, and is why Northern England still has a bit more of a Celtic flavor to this day. So yeah, I don't know about y'all, but all 3 of these kind of seem like a bad day for the Britons. I guess Model 3 is the closest to being sort of chill. Yeah, your bosses are probably extra douchey, but hey, at least you have your mates. An interesting discovery made in a recent study with an especially fancy schmancy DNA tech is that a lot of the Anglo-Saxon people that were uncovered at this Anglo-Saxon burial site that's dated deep into the 6th century were of first generation descent, like them or their parents first got there to Britain from the mainland, making it evident that the Anglo-Saxon migration was a continuous process with a steady flow of migrants over the course of a century or so. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain most likely kept contact with the relatives from the mainland multiple generations in. Okay, Russ, there was some distinct social advantages for the Anglo-Saxons, fine. But how on earth would that constitute them making up to half of the DNA in England now? Well, when the 10% steady inflow of Germanic migrants was run through a data model that applied a calculated percentage of social reproductive advantage, especially for the males, the result was that 2 million natives to 150,000 Saxon population could have 50% Anglo-Saxon DNA in as little as 5 generations. Listen, if you want to take a look at that study, it's in the description. Be my guest. I simply just have no idea how that works. I stared at the graphs and models on the screen and I just have no idea how that works. Thank the Lord for that little discussion bit that told me what to make of it. But listen, back on the humanities front, a bit of common sense will make you realize that early England had a pretty icy view of their Breton roommates. I mean, all of the waterways were renamed into Germanic names. The English language has minute influence from the Brittonic language, and deep in the 8th century, Bede's ecclesiastical history takes its time to regard the island's natives as second class. Yes, there's plenty of scientific evidence to prove the theory of oppression, but there's also just plenty of proof in the pudding too. But if there was so much disdain, then how did they end up so mixed anyways? Well, now it's time to talk about dynamics that made the situation just a bit more nuanced. Alright, first things first, the main thing to highlight is that within England, the rules and the way that people interacted with each other was in no way the same region to region. The laws of King Ine in Wessex meant absolutely nothing in the Kingdom of Northumbria. Relations between the Britons and the Saxons could even be different village to village. England in the 6th century was in no way united culturally and most certainly not politically. Yeah, the Britons are absolute table busters. Disregard them. Man, in my village, the Britons are fine. Y'all are weird. For example, on a gravesite in Oakington that can be dated to the 6th century, all of the wealthiest graves can be identified as of indigenous descent, and all of the poorest graves seem to be of recent continental immigrant descent.
This displays a way of life much more familiar to modern times, where immigrants were farmers and foot soldiers, and native power brokers used the influx of fresh sets of hands to grow their enterprise.
But contemporary sources like the Breton Gildas said that the Anglo-Saxons were uniformly ruthless marauders, right? I mean, I used a Gildas quote as a cliffhanger on my last episode, right? And Bede's ecclesiastical history doubles down on this, despite Bede being an Anglo-Saxon himself.
Well, Bede using Gildas as one of his primary sources in the reperpetrating the stereotypes of the differences between the decadent Britons and the vigorous and dominant Saxons is him speaking the sentiment of his time.
That I'll concede to the previous viewpoint. Whistle sound, yellow card, Bede. Go sit on the bench, you're making my job hard.
But concerning Gildas, it's a different story. Gildas wrote on the ruin of Britain as a diss track for his peers in the church and general population. Within the context of the book, he and his fellow Britons were likened to the people of Israel. The invasion of the Anglo-Saxons was not some kind of cruel twist of fate, but rather divine punishment for the Briton people, as Gildas believed that they had become corrupt and sinful.
This portrayal of the invaders as a necessary cleansing hand is one of the reasons that On the Ruin of Britain even survived throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. In a weird way, it was almost sort of favorable for the Anglo-Saxon narrative. Although Gildas did not hold back one bit, he did call them a most hateful and impious race. I mean, those are some strong words. Wonder what the Anglo-Saxons thought when they first saw that.
Oh, wow. Well, at least we can avert it. Yeah.
One of the most telling aspects that assists the oppression narrative for the native Britons is the absolute lack of their culture and the English culture that formed, or Old English, I guess you could say would be more proper.
Well, Old English actually does have some influence from Celtic languages. It's theorized that the way vowels are pronounced in Old English is of a more Celtic form, as well as frequency of conjecture. When you see people speaking on the oppression of Britain's natives, you'll often hear people say that Old English has no Celtic words. This is simply not true. When examined closely and with more adequate technology that could crunch this kind of stuff in an algorithm, Old English possibly has hundreds of Celtic words. Possibly. I'm not going to pinky promise you on this one.
Another one of the more consistent points in the apartheid theorists, and certainly a consistent point in the research papers that I take a look at today, is the sheer amount of continental DNA in the modern English person. How else could that much EDM and awkward humor DNA make it to Britain with just a migration wave that consisted just 10% of the population? Well, the Anglo-apocalypse theorists failed to ever mention the sheer amount of Germanic DNA that could have came during the Roman period.
For starters, remember the Belgi, or the Belgic Gauls? The guys from northern France who were sent running after being defeated by Caesar and then came to Britain and said, "Base." Well, the Belgi were actually of mixed Celtic and Germanic descent.
So that could have been a source of DNA?
The Roman army recruited from Germanic populace and provinces, and a garrison had to live on the island for 25 years. They could have gotten freaky with the local women.
There's another potential source of DNA.
After Diocletian's reforms in the 4th century, field armies became a thing. At that point, the Roman army started to be thoroughly Germanicized. Whole field armies of captured Germanic, single, military-aged men were packed up and sent off to Britain. And then on top of that, their unit was mixed with the Briton field armies, and they were expected to live alongside the general populace.
Wow, holy smokes, does that open up some opportunities for Germanic DNA. Combine that with the fact that modern DNA analysis cannot separate Germanic DNA that's specifically Anglo-Saxon from Germanic DNA that could be from other sources, including sources that could have been after the Anglo-Saxon migration. You get a bit of a sense that this evidence is inconclusive.
There was plenty of mainland input later with the Vikings, the Normans, the Flems, as well as just a few good God-fearing, run-of-the-mill immigration waves in the 1800s. Remember how I said there was little to no material evidence of Romano-British culture in the Anglo-Saxon period? Well, archaeology suggests that Romano-British material culture had already thoroughly collapsed before the Anglo-Saxons even got there. A product of the native Britons never truly being invited to the Rome party, most likely. But all of this side of the debate can be set to the side by the simple fact that the Anglo-Saxons were an invading force. You can't argue that the Anglo-Saxons all had flowers behind their ears and they were holding hands with the native Britons and dancing in a big circle and singing Kumbaya if they showed up on their wooden boats, no invite, no RSVP, and with a bad attitude, right? So yeah, that's right. It's they were invaders, so you can't really argue much more after that. Let's wrap this up. Wrong! Breaking news, plot twist. The Britons actually asked the Anglo-Saxons to be there. In the post-Roman period, Brittonic kingdoms or tribal confederations or whatever you want to call it were in a state of constant civil war, as well as invasions by neighboring Celts such as the Picts and the Scots. In a true move that flaunted their Roman heritage, Brittonic warlords began to house large amounts of Germanic mercenaries on the east of the island, to the point that the Saxon mercs even brought their families and relatives. This pool of military might was subsequently dipped into by various Brittonic kings in this case of a regional dispute or a pirate purge. Matter of fact, contact with the Anglo-Saxon populace was so high that the Breton leader Vortigern even fell in love with the mercenary warrior Hengist's daughter and wed her against his better judgment in the 5th century. Anglo-Saxon domination on the island actually began as a mercenary revolt rather than an invasion. So then the Anglo-Saxons invited their relatives that were still in the continent, and the rest is history. And the Anglo-Saxon mercenaries didn't just live in East England either. There's evidence of Saxon settlement in the territory of Wessex as early as the first quarter of the 5th century, well before the mercenary revolt in the Anglo-Saxon period properly began. And these Saxon settlements and the local Britons must have gotten busy, freaky diggy, as the founders of the Kingdom of Wessex were evidently a mixed batch, with legendary trailblazers like Cedric and Cynric being identifiably Brittonic with their names. Acculturation of very much genetically Brittonic people into presenting themselves as Anglo-Saxons is plenty evident as well. A 1997 excavation of a Breton village shows no Anglo-Saxon artifacts at first, but as the centuries progress, more and more appear. The thing is, the skull shape and physical characteristics of the human remains don't change at all, pointing to a scenario in which there was no population replacement, at least there. While we're on the topic of physical changes, Anglo-Saxon burials that originally just consisted of the immigrants themselves actually have their average height drop by 5 millimeters by the end of the 8th century. This shows that the actually ethnically Anglo-Saxons over the course of some time were just mixing with the natives. The immigrant great-grandpa was probably like,
"See? Birds of a feather. I told you not to mix with them. Kiss the NBA contract, I get goodbye. We're never making it out of Worcester, Leicestershire now. Never." I have no idea what accent that was supposed to be. I don't have a ghost of a clue.
By the end of the Anglo-Saxon period in the 8th century, famous laws were issued by a guy named King Alfred after defeating the Vikings and solidifying the English identity. In them, Alfred fails to differentiate the native Britons from the Anglo-Saxons, despite basing his decree on the earlier Wessex laws of King Ine, who talked all kinds of smack on the natives. King Alfred might have felt where the wind was blowing and saw these sentiments as dated and distracting. So factoring in all this information, how do I personally see that this situation played out? Well, I think it more or less played out in the order that the viewpoints were presented, funnily enough. I stated how the relationships between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons varied greatly region to region, but the consistency of how the Britons are talked about in writing across the entire territory of England paints a picture of a condescending view of the Britons that spanned in the general Anglo-Saxon culture. Yeah, Mercia might have been in a passionate scuffle with Wessex and had different ways they took the land survey, but kings in both kingdoms were exchanging top 10 roasts for the Welsh and negotiating their order during diplomatic talks. I think it probably was a pretty rough time for the Britons after the initial mercenary revolts. And in the 5th and the 6th century, I think there really was a genuine effort to wipe the memory of the Brittonic people. Where there was nuance region to region was mainly in the practical lengths gone to achieve this goal. In places like the north, in Northumbria, it was just the changing of the aristocratic customs and language by the new elites, and may I say they were quite successful at it. I mean, Northumbria was still very much English, and other regions seem to have a strikingly modern racial view of it, with the outright banning of intermarriage and enforcing it, evidently, from the burial evidence. And then others just had all of the male population wiped out. Now, that's just standard warband stuff, but still. In all of these models, the Breton Celtic culture was pushed and squeezed into the margins and not allowed to exist in an overt form. I don't think this ancient tragedy should be completely lost on us or made into some sort of nuanced or morally gray affair. Something that confounded me in my study is the question, why were the Britons treated by such passionate disdain by the Anglo-Saxons? Like, what was the rhyme or reason? What was the logic? Yes, they changed the names of all of the natural landmarks and really everything, and only allowed for the Breton population to exist if completely assimilated. But why? Was it Machiavellianism? Was it enforced cohesion to ensure peace in the realm? Or was it just raw, inconsolable tribalism? When other cultures merge together, there's plenty of influence seen from both parents, so to speak. Concerning the Britons, their culture was deliberately kept out of the mix despite outnumbering the invaders 4-1. I think the Anglo-Saxons saw the Britons as weak, and the systems they employed to sort of scrub clean their new land of the Britons was something that was justified to them in their martial identity. Like they wanted to protect their offspring from this inherent weakness. Martial valor is the most consistent value held across all of the Germanic societies and was plenty evident in their Great Migration period. Martial and combat toughness was what the Romans noted and actually admired about the Germanics in the BCs. And this focus and presentation of martial toughness is actually what the Turks noted about the Latin Crusaders much later, who came really originally from the same stock as the Anglo-Saxons. The Britons were majority unarmed and perhaps a bit cowed by Roman rule. The Britons falling to the Anglo-Saxons unanimously invited the Anglo-Saxons to view them in this condescending way, especially since the Anglo-Saxons were still in their very hoo-ha pagan form. The story of King Arthur, which survived up to this day, it's actually pretty cool. It is a Briton story. It is a uniquely Romano-British story, and it's about a great Briton warrior who made the last stand against the Anglo-Saxons and kept off the Anglo-Saxon invasion and takeover, at least for a little bit. And apparently he actually existed, but after he passed away, the Germanic wave just continued. And that's very sad. In order for a legend from these people to outlive them. The Britons don't exist anymore, but the stories that they had to tell still do. It shows that they very much cared about their identity, making it all a tragedy. But many such cases, you know. As time passed, though, the actual segregation and racism became impractical. Real states with real stakes started to form, and constantly ensuring that blood stayed pure is an expensive and complicated affair. Not to mention excluding naturally talented knights and bureaucrats because they're not of a pure Saxon stock is wasteful to say the least. What really drove a nail in it was outside invasions. Worrying about if someone is a Welshman or a Saxon when Danish Vikings are robbing everyone's house regardless then seems really trivial. After the initial Viking incursions, all categorizing of the commoners ceased to exist. In order to survive and stand up to foreign threats, these labels had to be dropped. Much harder to break sticks when they're banded together. Still, it could be argued that this air of superiority stuck in the subconscious of the nation despite segregation going away. The act of believing culture should not be allowed to even have any kind of voice due to them being perceived as weaker is a view that is sometimes tacked on as some sort of Anglo-English innovation in modern political discussions. While that is an absolutely gross oversimplification of a blatantly human element, later English history has the views held by those newly wealthy Anglo-Saxon warlords laying silently in their tombs come roaring awake once again, just with a different setting and different peoples. Alright, next episode we'll be taking it much easier with a simple narrative style talking about the Germanic kingdom's initial rise when they first started to assert themselves. I know I just spent a half hour talking about their devious bigotry, but I'm gonna have to shelf those notions and talk about the awesome king of Mercia charging into battle with his mates or something. I don't know. I haven't read the history yet. Sorry, Briton Bob, Mr. King Arthur. Your plight is not forgotten. Next episode is about the early Anglo-Saxon come up. Please like and subscribe. It helps way more than you know. See you next time. Ciao.